Well, a very good afternoon to you, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the LSE virtually for this online event. My name is Tony Travers, and I'm Associate Dean of the School of Public Policy and a Professor in the Department of Government here at the LSE. I'm very pleased to welcome Iain Dale as our guest to the LSE this afternoon. As many of you will know, I'm sure, Iain is a commentator and broadcaster who presents the evening show on LBC Radio. He's a visiting professor of politics and broadcasting at the University of East Anglia, and I think an alumnus of there. He co-hosts a weekly podcast with former Home Secretary Jackie Smith called For the Many, and the Iain Dale Book Club podcast, the Iain Dale All Talk podcast, and a podcast of his weekly cross-question political panel show. He's a regular columnist for The Telegraph, The Evening Standard, and other news outlets. For those of you on Twitter in the audience, and Twitter is going to get discussed, I suspect, today, the hashtag for the event is hashtag LSE Get Along. And this online event is being recorded and hopefully, with luck, will be made available as a podcast, subject to there being no technical difficulties. There will be an opportunity, as ever, for Q&A, and the best way of doing this is to put questions for Iain in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions will then appear on the side of my screen here, and I will be able to forward them on to Iain. So what I want to do really is, before get going, by the way, as I said, this is goes alongside Iain's book, which is being launched, or has already been launched. You can see it in very plain sight just behind Iain on his screen. And this is obviously a book. It's called Why Can't We All Just Get Along? Shout Less, Listen More. And everybody I think everybody watching will know how we've all come to think that somehow public discourse has been made more difficult, slightly more aggressive, perhaps a lot more aggressive, cruder in recent years. And against that backdrop, the challenge is how we continue to have a robust debate with the ideas being put forward, tested, explored, explained, and so on, but without resorting to, well, frankly, just abuse. Now, at the beginning of, the very beginning of Iain's book, I'm now talking to you, Iain, I should say. You quote a tweet which effectively inspired you. So here's my copy of the book, and if I can just turn to page 2, which is where this. So I'm going to have to bleep out some of this. FYI,
I think we're all adults.
Well, even so, FYI, I'm very happy to engage. This is your response to somebody who'd sent a tweet to you. FYI, I'm very happy to engage in polite debate on any issue. I probably respond more than most. However, if you call me a C*****T, use profane language or insult me for no reason, I will mutably block you. No questions asked. You never dare say it to my face, so don't do it here. And that kind of gets to the nub of all of this, doesn't it? But before we get to that nub, can you just explain, you must have thought that tweet may have pushed you over the edge to write the book, but this must have been building up as you watched public discourse for several years before you started. Is that right?
It is right. There were several things that prompted me to do it. The first was back in 2018, when we were at the height of all of the Brexit shenanigans. And believe me, this book is not all about Brexit. There is one chapter about it, but I think the Brexit debate really crystallized a lot of the arguments that I'm putting forward here, where people just wouldn't accept that there was another side to the argument. And I've always thought that if you don't make an effort to first of all acknowledge that somebody else might have a different point of view to you and they have every right to hold that view, then I think you're not going to get very far. And if you are trying to engage in a debate, how can you really do that if you don't actually understand why somebody is arguing what they're arguing, whether it's about Brexit or anything else? So you have to start from that standpoint. It sounds a bit basic, but I think we've lost the art of accepting that other people have the right to hold a different view to ourselves. Too many people nowadays are seeking self-validation. That they watch the news channels that they think they agree with. They won't listen to some. I mean, the number of times I get people saying to me, "Oh, I love listening to you, Ian, but I'm not listening to James O'Brien." And you think, well, why wouldn't you listen to somebody that you disagree with? Because then you can marshal your own arguments in a much more informed and better way. So it was the Brexit debate that I think sort of really brought home to me that the public discourse was just going completely awry. And I will admit that I played a part in this, that I'm a human being just like anyone else. And if somebody calls me a twat or whatever on Twitter, my instant human reaction is to respond and instantly start typing out a tweet calling them something worse, and then it escalates from there. And it wasn't just that tweet that you've just read out that really I think a lot of people could relate to. When I tweeted that, it got thousands of retweets, and I just called it my Twitter rules. If you do this, I will block you. And a lot of people got in touch saying, "Oh, can I use those as my Twitter rules?" I said, "Well, of course you can. It's a public platform. Why wouldn't you?" So that was back in 2018. And then in Christmas 2018, the Queen, in her Christmas message, effectively said, "Look, why can't we all just get along?" And I mean, she didn't use those exact words, but that was the message. And the Mail on Sunday got in touch and said, would I write for their next Sunday's newspaper an article based on that premise? So I wrote this 1,500-word article, got a massive response to it. And I didn't then think, oh, I will now write a book. But a few months later, Emily Maitlis published her book, Airhead, which is a brilliant, anyone interested in broadcasting, buy it. It is fantastic. It's essentially 40 chapters of where she goes through her broadcasting career and relates various anecdotes. And I mean, it's got quite amusing, but also very informative about how news works. And I started reading this and I thought, I could write this book. And I started jotting down sort of chapter headings, things that she wrote about just would spark off a memory in my mind. So I got in touch with my agent and said, look, I've got this idea for a book with Emily, similar to the one Emily Maitlis has done. And they said, well, HarperCollins have come up with an idea for a book for you along the decline of public discourse because they saw your Mail on Sunday article. And they want you to write a response to James O'Brien's book, How to Be Right in a World Gone Wrong. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to have a book that I write be defined by anyone else. I'll write my own book, thank you very much. It's not going to be a response. And that's where we got to. We sort of melded the two ideas together. So there are sort of lots of autobiographical bits in this, from particularly from my career in politics and the media. And I try to bring in the public discourse element into each chapter. And then at the end of the book, I got to the end and I thought, you know what, I think I've diagnosed a lot of the problems. Have I come up with the solutions? So, and then I thought, well, rather than go back to each of the 19 chapters and sort of add bits in, I'll do 50 ways that we can improve public discourse. Some of them are pretty obvious, but I don't think anyone's ever written them down all in one place before. So there was an agenda just to sort of try and, I want everybody who reads the book, I want at the end of it to think, well, how am I contributing to this, and what can I do to make public discourse better? Which is a bit sort of kumbaya, motherhood and apple pie, I know, but that was the aim of the book.
Now, that's a very helpful intro to the whole logic for the book, and of course, buried in what you've just said are two slightly different issues, really. One is the willingness of people to accept other people have a point of view, or they believe in their country and they have their own patriotism or whatever it is. And separately, the language that people now use, which question they didn't use in the same way in the past. And I'm right to think there's two issues tied up in this. One is simply the willingness to accept other people have a point of view which is rational and should be treated fairly. And then secondly, the words that are used in pursuing a debate or discussion. Is that right? I mean, there are sort of two, they're overlapping but distinct issues.
They are. I think also the opportunity to put your viewpoint forward is so much bigger now than it ever has been. If we were having this conversation, say, 25 years ago, 1995, the internet was barely, I mean, it did exist, but email existed, and websites did exist, but fairly rudimentary. There was no social media at that point. Well, with the advent of blogs in the early 2000s, and then Twitter, 2000, Twitter didn't really become a big thing, I would say, until probably 2012, 13, but nothing like it is today. And then Facebook, Instagram, and all the other forms of social media. People now have the opportunity to put their viewpoint forward in a way that they just didn't before. Now, that's a great thing in many ways. Mrs. Miggins at 32 Acacia Avenue might write a letter to her local newspaper in 1995. She might get it published once a year, but that was really the only opportunity that she would have to get her view across. Well, when blogs started, of course, she had the opportunity to write a blog post.
Yeah.
Take a few minutes, publish it. Now, she might only have 50 or 60 people ever read it, but if they're in her local area, she might have an influence in her local area. Well, people got the hang of that very quickly, and blogs proliferated. I was kind of a first mover with Guido Fawkes and Tim Montgomery at Conservative Home, and the right really dominated the early blogosphere. I would say the left got much better at communicating via these mediums probably after 2010. But then you had, first of all, the mainstream media decrying this development. They thought of bloggers as rather sad people sitting in their pajamas in their mother's bedroom because they had nothing better to do, or they were people who wanted to be journalists but didn't quite cut the mustard. Both entirely wrong. And eventually, the mainstream media subsumed blogs. Now, and that was really after the advent of Twitter. Now, Twitter was sort of blog on crack, because a blog post you can write in a few minutes and post it, whereas a tweet, you just respond instantly. And that also is a great thing where people can comment on things, but it's also a very dangerous thing because it allows very evil people to have a voice as well. And it's very difficult to filter all of those out. And I think anybody who's now vaguely in the public eye finds that a very difficult process. And it can be a quite depressing process where if you hit the headlines for good or bad reasons, your life can be made a living hell by people on Twitter. So the whole point of that was to say that social media has become a great democratizing thing, but also quite a malevolent thing in some ways. And I think some of the social media companies, Twitter in particular, have not acted responsibly in trying to make sure that bad people don't misuse and abuse their platform. And that, I think Twitter more than anything has led to the rise of a really bad way of communicating with each other. But that's not to say that that didn't exist in the past. It did, but I think it's just become much more obvious of late.
Now, the book there's elements of an autobiography in the book as well, isn't it? You sort of tell some of this, you're making the points you're making in part by, sort of going through your own background. And that includes, and you've just touched on this, you were an early adopter of blogging and the sort of new media way of communication, but then you actually went into LBC, and I know you've done some written journalism before, but you've sort of moved from the new media to the traditional or the mainstream media. And I suppose that begs the question of, the fact that video didn't kill the radio star, or this time the other way round. The radio, that you've gone into, that all these media coexist in the way that TV didn't kill off the radio, neither of them killed off the cinema, and none of them. So is that how you see it, that you're sort of, you've migrated into the traditional media, but that, now question, it gives you a bigger, wider platform, or what? I mean, to explain why you decided to do it, perhaps.
I mean, when I was in my teens and 20s, there were two things I wanted to do. I wanted to be an MP and I wanted to be a radio presenter. Well, I tried to be an MP. I fought an election in 2005, but the electorate fought back quite massively. So, and it was all a question of timing, really. And I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And by the time we got to 2010, I'd started a new business. I was started Total Politics magazine and Bite Back Publishing, and I took 2 years out of parliamentary selections. And by the time I got back into it, frankly, it was too late. I nearly got Bracknell. I was up against Philip Lee and Rory Stewart. I think they had cause to rather regret the selection there in the end. But after that, I thought, well, at the next election, I'm going to be, what, 52, 53. I'm not going to flog a dead horse. And by that time, LBC was on the horizon. They then offered me a 5-day-a-week show. So I thought, okay, well, I've got 50% of what I wanted to do, which is probably more than a lot of people ever do. But I've never seen this sort of battle between the internet media and so-called mainstream media. To me, everyone can coexist quite happily. I think what blogs did was actually hold the mainstream media to account in a way that hadn't really been done before, and they didn't like it. That's why they tried to subsume blogs and succeeded in the end. And I think even now, you can see how some websites actually, I think, perform quite a good public service in keeping mainstream media broadcasters and journalists on their toes, sometimes effectively, sometimes quite insultingly. And I don't think of myself as being on the mainstream media side now, having been on the other side before. I use social media to promote what I do on LBC. I mean, I was on Politics Live just before coming on here, so of course I tweeted that I was going to be on. Now, people have a choice. I mean, they're just, what I found is if I don't do that, you get people saying, well, why didn't you tell us you were on this program? I'd have liked to have watched. So, but then again, there are other people saying, oh, not Iain Dale again. He's on all of these programs. Can't they find anyone else?
In fairness, you are promoting a book at the moment. So, I mean, that's a good reason to be everywhere.
Indeed. But so I don't think my LBC show would be as successful as it's been had I not used social media in this way. Now, a lot of my colleagues don't do that. Some do, some don't. James O'Brien, for example, is a very good example of somebody who became quite a big name because of the internet. When his viral clips on Brexit started being put on Facebook, sort of 90 seconds of him sort of having a monologue about something or other, he attracted then a much younger audience to LBC. So you've got 5 Live and Radio 4 obsessing about getting a youth audience. Well, we've done it. I mean, our 15 to 24 listenership is higher than most music stations. I mean, most music stations aimed at that age group. So we've kind of got the next generation listening to us now, and I see that through the phone calls that we get. But there are some people who just don't particularly want to engage with social media in the mainstream media. Well, I think they're missing an opportunity.
I mean, you say in the book, and you're very candid about this, that you suffer from what you call impostor syndrome, or that you are a shy person. I think a lot of people, I think privately, and I would say this myself, feel slightly the same. So I think it's in a sense, it's interesting you've said it to make the point so other people can feel comfortable with it. But you might argue, certainly in the context of a book like this and about a whole range of things, that being cautious and thinking about what you say for these reasons, kind of, a bit like an airline pilot who checks everything before they take off, is a good thing. That is, you're going to be that much more cautious and measured in what you do and say. I mean, do you think that therefore, if you flipping it round, people who are a bit overconfident, not very shy, there's a risk they're going to wade in without thinking, which you've sort of said about using Twitter without thinking about that?
Well, that risk is always there, whatever you're doing. Look, I host a 3-hour radio show each night, a lot of which is based on phone-ins. I've got no idea who's going to phone me. I've got no idea what they're going to say. Well, actually, that's not quite true, because there's somebody who answers the phone, the producer, and then they put a little summation of what the caller is going to say in the box on the screen. So I do have a vague idea of the main point that they tell the producer that they're going to make. Whether they actually do that or not is of course, a different matter. So I'm responding to what they're saying. And I mean, if they are incendiary, then I have to follow my own advice, in that I'm generally not going to have a shouting match with them. I will try and calm the situation, explain why what they've said is extreme, and maybe they'd like to sort of rethink. And I mean, I have quite a calm, well, I'm told I have quite a calm, soothing voice. So I am not there as a shock jock. I mean, I've never thought of myself in that way. I don't go on the radio to provoke people. Well, I want to provoke a good debate, but if I'm a lazy radio presenter and I just want to have a full switchboard of calls all the time, I will then do all these subject: immigration, benefits, abortion, Israel. I mean, everyone knows what they are. I like to challenge my audience a bit and pick subjects. I mean, even now, after doing it for 11 years, there are still some subjects that I think, oh, we haven't ever done that. Let's do that tonight. And I'll give you an example, and I talk about this a little bit in the book. Some years ago, I was nearly raped. Now, I kind of wrote it in the book as a bit of an aside. It only takes up, I think, 1 page, because it didn't traumatize me at the time, and it doesn't now. And the Observer interviewed me about it. They said it was going to be about a TV program called I Will Destroy You, where there's a male rape scene. And they said they just wanted me to comment on it. But the actual article, in the end, was all about my experience, which took me aback a little bit. And I thought, okay, well, let's actually embrace this. So the next night, I did a 2-hour phone-in and asked men to phone in if they'd ever been either raped, sexually assaulted, or somebody had attempted to do it. And the switchboard went mad. And this is one of those subjects that people don't really ever talk about. And so I could use that experience that I had had to really send out a message to people. Well, you're not alone, that there are other people this has happened to, and the volume of the calls indicated that. And when I found out from one of the a male rape charity called Survivors UK, that the average time it takes for a man to tell anybody else about that experience is 26 years. Now, if you think about the mental health, the anxieties, the depression that people will have gone through, or some people will have gone through in that time, that's where you can really challenge your audience in a way that you just will never do if you're talking about Brexit or coronavirus or the usual kind of subjects. And often you only need 5 good calls in an hour to make it a good phone-in. You don't have to have the phones ringing off the hook. You just have to have people who've got an interesting story to tell, which listeners will be able to relate to. So I think radio is such a powerful medium for that sort of thing. We do a mental health hour each week. We've done it since all through coronavirus. And I know, because I get the emails, some people tweet me to say, if you hadn't been talking about these subjects, I would have thought I was alone, and I dread to think what I might have done. I've had people say that, well, I was seriously contemplating suicide, but I listened to you and Emma Kenny. She's a professional psychotherapist who joins me on the program. And I know that there are people alive today that wouldn't be alive had we not been doing that. And you do feel a sense of responsibility there. And so it kind of goes back to the very first page of the book, where I say, the question that I'm most asked is when I tell people what I do, oh, you're a shock jock then? No, I'm really not. I'd like to think I'm the antithesis of it.
I mean, you're not a shock jock. And by the way, there are some questions coming in, so if you do put questions on the chat, I will get to you very soon. I mean, you're not a shock jock, and I think it's fair to say your colleagues at LBC, although they are opinionated, which is a good thing in some ways, it's not doing shock jockery at all. But you live in a world, we all live in a world now with a growing array of culture wars. Britain used to have no real culture wars in the way that perhaps American politics had on a number of issues, including most obviously abortion. Whereas we've now got effectively culture wars in the sense that people who are on one side of the argument just don't want to hear or want to stop other people on the other side even being heard. So just I wrote myself a list in preparation, clearly Brexit, trans rights, British history changing and understanding of, wokery anti-wokery, both sides of that argument, and even COVID-19 and whether or not you should wear a mask or not. So am I right? Do you detect at the end of your phone lines every day that we are creating more and more of these binary issues where people are simply, and I think this is the purpose of your book really, unwilling even to countenance that people on the other side should have a voice.
Yes, is the answer.
I know
I actually
that's what the
don't.
book's about, but
I don't really
why
like.
where they all come from so suddenly? Why has it all appeared?
Well, I don't really like this phrase culture wars, because there's part of me that thinks the more you use the phrase, the more you're actually promulgating the fact that there is a culture war. But then on the other hand, if you try and pretend that it's not happening, you brush it under the carpet, I suppose. Part of it has come from the United States, where over the last 10 years, if you're on the right, you get your news from Fox News. If you're on the left, you get your news from CNN or MSNBC, and never the twain shall meet. You don't listen to views that might challenge your own. That has always been the case in this country to a much more limited extent in the newspaper world. Uniquely in this country, we have or had about a dozen national newspapers. I can't think of any other country that does that. If you go to most European countries, they will have regional newspapers. There are very few that have daily nationals that have the kind of loyalty that ours have had over the years. And again, here, if you are on the right, you traditionally buy the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph. If you're on the left, you buy the Mirror or the Guardian, or possibly the Independent in the past. And it's now also the same on websites. If you're on the left, you might look at the Huffington Post. If you're on the right, you'll look at the Spectator. We've always had tribes in our life, and we always will do. I'm on the right tribe if I want to. A lot
So
of
you're a
people think,
Gladstonian liberal, really.
well, I am actually. You see, a lot of people think I've gone all woke recently, which for reasons I still can't quite fathom, but there we go. But I belong to the West Ham United tribe. We all have our little tribes that we defend if they're under attack. And of course, Trump's great success in many ways success in inverted commas, has been to polarize American society in a way that no other US president has done in history. And so he has got, if you look at the opinion polls at the moment, yes, he might be behind Biden, but there's a hell of a lot of shy Trump supporters out there who would never tell an opinion pollster that they vote for Donald Trump. And the fact that he's even polling in the 40s when he's doing things that I suspect most people watching us now would think are just completely unfathomable, says a lot. And he made a really interesting comment yesterday where he was saying that his record on coronavirus, he'd give himself an A+ for, but he'd give himself a D for communications. Well, I think it's actually the other way round. I think in many ways he's communicated brilliantly to people who are susceptible to the types of arguments that he's putting forward. Now, we haven't quite got that in our politics, and I genuinely hope we never do. It used to be the whole sort of religious side of American politics that I feared might infiltrate our politics in this country. That hasn't really happened. But I'm still astonished at how many people in this country still think that Donald Trump is a bit of a god, and that whatever he does, he's absolutely right, and they will defend him to the hilt no matter what he does, no matter what he says. It's the same if you look at Putin. There are so many people in this country that will defend Putin and Russia, and that can't see anything bad about him at all. And they will get all of their, or most of their, news input from Russia Today or some weird conspiracy site that's probably run by David Icke.
Oh, yes, exactly. Now, I'm going to take a first question here, if I may. This is from John Smith, who's an LSE student from Newcastle. I take it that's upon time, but it could be underlined. So what do you think would be the one change of policy which would have the biggest impact? Now, I guess that means what could government, broadly defined, do that would take us nearer to a more rational discourse? You've touched on this already, I think, about media. Anyway, let me let you answer it rather than me answering it. But what would you think government, UK or globally, should do?
I can't answer that question because I don't actually believe it's down to governments to do this. I think all governments can do is try and set the tone themselves. And we have a prime minister who, should we say, is not too brilliant at doing that, where he will be in prime minister's questions up against Keir Starmer, who is trying to offer support and be constructive generally, not always, but generally. And then Boris Johnson throws it back in his face and just sort of starts his party political stuff. Well, that at the moment in this coronavirus crisis is not the way to go. So the only thing that politicians can do rather than government, I think, is to try and set a tone. That doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't have robust debates. I don't want to have a sort of saccharine Prime Minister's question time, but everything has its time and has its place. I think the media generally could do a lot to change things. I talk a lot in the book about the art of the political interview and the fact that everything is dominated by sound bites and journalists putting gotcha questions to politicians rather than trying to seek the truth or get politicians to explain things. We saw that in the daily press conferences, where you would have all of the big name journalists put questions to the Prime Minister or to other ministers just designed to embarrass them. They were gotcha questions, all designed to make sure that they got their slot on the 10 o'clock news. And the interesting questions, the ones that actually did get interesting answers from the politicians, generally came from the regional or local journalists that were sort of allowed to ask questions a little bit down the line, because I think Downing Street worked out that, well, this wasn't working with these sort of prancing, grandstanding journalists. Let's get some others in. And there were so many that actually they were the ones that generated the headlines, because they did get the politicians to say something interesting. We're seeing the return of the long form interview now, particularly in podcasts, where a politician after 5 minutes runs out of sound bites. So inevitably they're going to say something new and hopefully something interesting. I did an hour-long interview with David Cameron on Thursday last week. Where do you see hour-long interviews anymore? And it wasn't a sort of one of these grilling forensic interviews. It was a conversation, but people got a lot out of that, because they found that, well, that they maybe saw him in a different light. He opened up a lot. He was much more honest about things. If you're a politician, you go into the Today programme, you know that your interview is likely to last 5 minutes, unless it's the main slot at 8:10. And so you've got two things that your spin doctors have told you you've got to get over. From the interviewer's point of view, they've got to get a newsline out of that can go around the rest of the BBC or the rest of the media, as it is supposedly an agenda-setting programme for the rest of the day. So you've got these two conflicting views, and therefore the poor bloody listener gets nothing out of it.
Well, I totally agree with that, but at the risk of defending journalists to a journalist, I mean, the difficulty surely for journalists, I take your point about the gotcha question, but the difficulty for journalists, I think, again and again, is that they ask a question, politicians just don't answer it. I mean, that is the difficulty, isn't it? They simply will not give a direct answer. They simply either answer a different question or answer the question they decided to answer.
But that is in part the format of the interview, in that I've had so many politicians that they know that they've got a certain time slot, and they've got a particular message that they want to get out there. So yes, they go around the houses. Now, you're only ever going to get around that by actually giving them more space, which in today's society, where editors and producers think that the listener has got the attention span of a flea, that often doesn't happen. So what you've got to do is to provide platforms where that can happen. And at the moment, I mean, I am actually slightly encouraged that there are more programs now that do allow a bit more of a more general conversational interview. And a conversational interview is not a soft interview. People think sometimes that I'm a soft interviewer because I'm not rude to politicians. I don't shout at them because I just think it's counterproductive. You can actually, I'll give you an example. Several times I've done 20 to 25 minute interviews with politicians, and the newsline from the interview comes at minute 24 or 25, which is a bit flying by the seat of your pants, because you're a producer thinking, well, he's got nothing out of this so far. But that happens with increasing regularity, because as I say, they've often run out of things to say by that, or of the prepared things to say by the time you get to that point. And it's a bit like the Columbo approach. I mean, if you aren't of a certain age,
meaning the famous American fictional detective.
Yeah, and he would, just as he was going out the door after sort of quizzing a witness, he would turn around and say, just one final thing, and that was the killer question.
Yeah.
And it's slowly catchy monkey in a way. And I find that look, we all have different approaches to interviews. I like doing conversational interviews, and I don't really care if people think that they're soft, because I know they're not.
And it was famously said of Sir David Frost, I mean, Sir David Frost rather than Lord Frost, who is now negotiating Brexit, that he did these apparently gentle interviews to the point where accidentally people felt they'd fall into a trap he'd set them, which is slightly, I don't mean it's a trap, but it allowed them to become relaxed, I think. That's, you know, being relaxed and feeling it's a bit of an easier interview can be an easy way, a subtle way of getting them to say things they wouldn't normally discuss.
Yeah, and look, even politicians are human beings, you know. And if you go into an interview and your first question is, Minister, why have you told an outright lie? Shouldn't you be ashamed of yourself? Well, instantly the shutters go up.
Yeah.
Because I mean, that's just what human beings do. If you're under attack, the shutters go up, your defenses go up. Whereas, I mean, I remember the first time I ever interviewed Boris Johnson. It was the day that he announced that he was going to be candidate for London Mayor. And he came into the studio. I didn't know him particularly well. He sat down and I thought, well, I'll give him a bit of a soft question to start with, or what I thought was a soft question. And I said, so what's the first thing you would do as London Mayor? And you could sort of see the terror in his eyes. And he said, well, I think, yes, that was a good question. I think I'd well, that's what would I do? I think, And it was a pre-recorded interview, so I thought, oh, should we start again? Then I thought, no, sod it. If he can't answer a simple question like that, a real softball question, what's he doing running for London Mayor? Now, the rest of the interview passed off fine, sure, but I did think that was quite telling.
Okay, and that's some more questions, enough from me. Kishore Deer says, is it wiser to ignore social media instead of providing publicity for it? It's a classic question. It's a good one, though. Just ignore it or discuss it and build it up?
I think it depends on what you do. If I was not doing the job that I do now, would I be on Twitter? The answer is probably I would be. Would I contribute to Twitter? Possibly not. But I have to be, or I feel that I have to be on Twitter to just engage with my audience in a way, and I get a lot out of it. I get a lot of really interesting feedback. People say, well, I heard you say that on the program tonight. Have you thought about this? And so it can be a very positive thing. Yeah. But of course, sometimes if I do say something, if I say anything about Brexit, I mean, I might as well not look at Twitter for 2 days. I made that mistake yesterday, responding to something that David Hennig, one of the trade experts, had said. And within 5 minutes, I thought, why did you even respond? Because you just get the tired old abuse, tired old arguments, and it was just people trying to refight the referendum all over again. And there have been times where I have literally not been able to look at it, particularly if I criticize Nicola Sturgeon in any way at all. The so-called cybernats descend on you like locusts, and it is a very, very unpleasant experience. And I sometimes then just have to switch it off and can't look at it.
Not good. Okay, and another question from Alberto Kessel, who's an LSE student. It's the beginning of term, so it's good to see you all. I indirectly feel you in the ether, as it were. Have social media algorithms contributed to the creation of echo chambers, increasing polarization surrounding political discourse? So there's a sort of an issue buried in all of this of an array of what goes on in social media may or may not be from human beings, adding further to the problem.
Well, I think that was the case on Facebook. I think Facebook have taken steps to change that in a way. Twitter, I think, is altogether very different because I remember one incident where I just thought, you know what, you need to stop doing this. It was at midnight. I was in bed, I had my laptop on my pillow, and I was engaging in an argument, I can't remember what about, with a Twitter profile that didn't have a picture, it just had the egg, and it had 6 followers. I'm thinking, why am I doing this? What is the point of engaging with somebody who's probably, I mean, I don't know whether they're a real human being or not, but that's where Twitter, I think, has failed as an organization. They could root out all of these bots if they wanted to. What I find now is invariably, if somebody's having a really aggressive go at me, they've generally got under 10 followers. And you can just see from their profile, there's something odd about it. Now, I don't know whether it's sort of Russian Twitter farms or something, or automated bots. I have no idea. But all I know is that these are not genuine people, and Twitter ought to be able to root them out. Just with the sign-up process, for example, they ought to be able to make sure that, I mean, I'm not asking for everybody to give their full name on screen on Twitter, because, I mean, if you're a civil servant, for example, you wouldn't really be able to do that. But there has to be a way of doing it in a sign-up process. I can do it on my West Ham blog. I can root out all of these people, and I get loads of people with a sort of .ru or some weird and wonderful country where you know perfectly well, just from the format of the email address that they have to verify themselves on, you know that they're not a real person. So if I can do that on my own West Ham blog, West Ham till I die, if there are any Hammers fans out there watching, why can't Twitter? And I don't know the answer to that.
And I mean, this is going to become a big issue, I think, personally, a big issue of public policy when it comes to the question of what proportion of the population is eventually vaccinated, assume we get there, because the degree of anti-vax propagation, if that's not an unfortunate way of putting it, on social media is clearly going to be an element, is it not, in the extent to which a society like Britain can finally and eventually eradicate COVID-19.
Well, you're absolutely right, and even I can't remember when it was that Andrew Wakefield came out with all of this sort of anti-vax stuff, but it was probably at least 12 years ago, maybe longer. There are still an awful lot of people who subscribe to that point of view, and I did a phone in a couple of months ago about, well, if there was a vaccine, would you take it? And I was horrified by the number of people that would phone in, quite sensible people on everything else, who said, no, I'd be really suspicious of it, because obviously these things need to be tested for years and it wouldn't have been tested enough. And I mean, that is actually, I mean, you can see the logic of that argument. I mean, the Russians have said that they have successfully made a vaccine that's entirely safe. Well, it's apparently been tested on 76 people. Now, I don't know about you, and I'm not being anti-Russian.
No.
But I am not going to take a Russian vaccine that's been tested on 76 people.
Okay, now a question from Alicia Donofrio. I hope I've got that right, Alicia, who's also an LSE student. How much does political correctness, she put it in an inverted comma, affect or limit your interviews? And you do talk a lot about the issue of language and the use of words in the book. So take us back into the book, but how far does the attempt to be, open quotes, politically correct, unquote, affect your interviews?
I'm not sure it affects interviews particularly. I do. There are some subjects where you feel that you're walking a tightrope, and if you fall off that tightrope, it could be career ending. And that's not because you actually want to say anything bad. It's just that there are some words nowadays which, particularly, I mean, I'm 58, there are words nowadays that I would have routinely used, as would everyone else 30 years ago, which are just not acceptable nowadays. And I think older generations had that. I mean, my mother used to refer to ethnic minorities as coloured people. Yeah. And me and my sister would say, no, you can't say that word anymore. She wasn't racist, but that was the word that her generation used to describe somebody who was non-white. Well, if I said that on the radio now, there'd be Ofcom complaints about it. When all the Black Lives Matter movement started, and the George Floyd murder, I mean, there were a couple of programs that were quite uncomfortable. I mean, one of them actually had a very positive outcome, where I had a caller phone in, Denise in Enfield, who was black, and she accused me of looking at this through my prism of white privilege. Well, again, my natural reaction is to defend myself and say, well, I think if you'd listened to my programs over the years, you'd know that wasn't the case. We started talking about empire. Then she started talking about the fact that there is only one non-white LBC presenter. And she said, well, and you've only got one woman. I said, well, actually, we've got two. Rachel Johnson's just joined. And she said, well, I wonder how she got through the door. And she said, I wouldn't get through the door. And I thought, you know what, you're right, you wouldn't. So she came and co-presented the program with me the next day, which was, shall we say, an innovation. Now, people can say, oh, well, that's just a token thing that you've done. But she has now had a chance to prove herself. She's done about 10 programs with me. She's now got a contract at LBC to do a program with me every fortnight. And she's got a chance to prove that she can do a real good job as a broadcaster. Now, I mean, I've had quite a few quite tough conversations with her on air, because she will look at it from the perspective of a black woman, and it has made me think about some of the things that maybe previously held views that I've had that I have to start questioning. But you mentioned the trans debate earlier on. I mean, that's another one which it's about the only subject that I'm slightly reluctant to dip my toe into, if I'm honest.
Why is that?
Because I think I talk about it in the book, because most people who do, I mean, look at J.K. Rowling, who to my mind has said some very inoffensive things and has stuck up for women's rights. You look at Suzanne Moore, the abuse that she's got, not least from fellow Guardian journalists on this issue. And I have done trans phone-ins before, but before the recent furore started. But you say one thing out of place on that subject, something that most people would think of as entirely inoffensive, but to some trans activists, you then are somebody who is beyond the pale, and they will move heaven and earth to remove you from your job. So I don't shy away from many things, but I'm afraid I'll be honest and say that is one that I haven't addressed in recent months.
Okay, well, I'll move on to another subject at that point. This is from, and there's a couple of questions along the same lines, and you address it in the book. You've touched on it already, but I think it is worth giving a bit more time to, which is Sydney Tromple, who's an LSE alumnus. Do you think social media could ever be regulated in the context of free speech? And is there a way to distinguish free speech from hate speech on social media? I think does get to a real, and I don't want to take us back into the trans issue, but the space between the regulation of hate speech and free speech at any point in time is a difficult one, but it's become more difficult, hasn't it?
It's an incredibly difficult area. I am naturally, I suppose, predisposed to not wanting hate crime laws because of the free speech element. Where do you draw the line? The Scottish government, I gather, has got a proposal to have a new hate crime law, which would effectively render most comedians at the Edinburgh Festival in breach of the law. Now, I don't know
yourself at the Edinburgh Festival, do you not? Not as a comedian, I stress, but as a
no, I'd quite like to, but I'm not courageous enough to do that. Each of us will have a different line to draw. Offending someone is not against the law, and nor should it ever be. If we really go down that path, we won't really be able to have much of a public discourse at all. But if I said something overtly racist in this medium or on the radio, I would expect to be held to account for it. Now, should that be under the criminal law? Should it be under some code of conduct? I don't know is the honest answer to that. I often go on the Jeremy Vine show on Channel 5, and they phoned me just before I came to do this. And I'm on it on Friday. And one of the subjects for discussion is, should misogyny be included as a hate crime? Now, think about that for a moment. Because I think misogyny, and you see, this is where I'm going to tread very carefully. To me, misogyny is different to racism or homophobia, because there is an opposite to misogyny, and I think is it called misandry, where it's sort of, I mean, if you can prove that a man killed a woman just because she was a woman,
Yeah.
well, good luck with that. I think that would be incredibly difficult to do. Somebody abuses someone just because they're a woman. I'm sure there are examples of where that's happened, but should the criminal law be involved? But I mean, there are women who hate men as well. I'm sure there may have been women who have killed a man just because he's a man. But how do you prove that? To my mind, if you're going to make something a criminal offence, it's got to be reasonably cut and dried as to what the motivation was. And I think with homophobia and racism, it is a little easier to define. But this is an incredibly difficult area for legislators to enter into, and then for lawyers and judges to interpret. So I think you have to be very careful about trying to legislate in areas where it's not possible. I think it's very difficult to regulate social media in many ways. That's not to say you shouldn't try, but I can't remember anywhere that anyone successfully regulated the internet, because it really would have to be done on a worldwide basis for obvious reasons. You can't just do it in one country, I don't think.
No, I mean, I think the further challenge is that society's attitudes move often very fast. I mean, it's worth remembering, I'm not reminding you, but it is, I'm sort of speaking aloud, but that there was no anti-discrimination, no anti-race discrimination legislation until the late 60s. Homosexuality was illegal until the late 1960s in the UK. And so, in this sense, the way the public views particular subjects and their regulation when it comes to public debate is moving fast, and politics have to keep up with it. And I suppose the difficulty for certainly the social media, the regulation of the social media, is that it gets much nearer to pure free speech than anything that could be written in a book or a newspaper or broadcast on TV or radio. But,
I mean, you look on Twitter and you look at I can't remember what the statistics were, but I was horrified at the number of police hours that are spent investigating tweets. I could have easily reported hundreds of tweets to the police. But in the end, do I want the police spending time on people that have insulted me on Twitter, albeit in a very aggressive way? Or do I want them to go and catch what I would call proper criminals? There are far too many people going through the legal system now for things that they might have said on Twitter in the heat of the moment. That's not to say that some of them shouldn't be going through, but the number at the moment are just, I mean, I know somebody who is one of these people, and I'm thinking, how did that ever get to court? Somebody in the police or the Crown Prosecution Service should have said, clearly this didn't really mean this. Yes, it was a horrible thing to say, but do you really think that they really intended carrying through with what they said? I think it's just got to a point where if we haven't got enough police in this country, well, let's actually deploy them on things that really matter.
We've sort of kept off Brexit, but there is a sort of, it's not a direct Brexit question, but you'll see, let me give you the question and you can sort of interpret it. You were in favour of the UK leaving the EU. You made that very clear, and you've made it clear before. But Chris Waits has asked the following: bearing in mind your book, do you think in retrospect the decision to leave did such damage to the social fabric of the country that that decision has outweighed the benefits that leaving the EU will give us? So he's sort of accepting there would be benefits, or at least the question is. But do you think that because it has become a bit of a culture war, do you think that despite the eruption of an ongoing culture war, which may take some years to be rid of, that it's still worth it? I don't want to go all over Brexit again, but do you see the difference? I'm not asking about Brexit, it's more about the damage to social discourse and relations and so on. Do you think it's still worth it despite all of that?
Well, I get a lot of people often saying to me, oh, well, I know you'll come over to the right side in the end. You'll see that this is such a disaster that you've made a mistake, which is incredibly patronizing, actually.
Yeah, no, but this is just asking in terms of the social discourse, the subject of the book, really. It's not asking,
well, I think that if there hadn't been a referendum, I suspect we might be in an even worse place than we are from that point of view now, because I think a referendum in the end would have been inevitable at some point. I think that's why David Cameron called it, actually, because he knew he couldn't put it off forever. It wasn't just a question of party management and all the rest of it. That there was a real issue to deal with. Now, I totally regret some of the ways that people have talked to each other in this on both sides, and there isn't one side to blame here. It is both sides, and I had thought actually that when Boris Johnson won the election, you could almost feel a total change in the country, that everybody realised, well, that's it. That there wasn't going to be this divisive debate about a second referendum and all the rest of it. And when the withdrawal agreement went through and we actually formally left the legal and political structures of the EU on the 31st of January, it was as if somebody had sort of pricked a balloon, and the animus seemed to go out of the debate. Now, I think and coronavirus bizarrely then took over. None of us really thought about Brexit for quite a few months. Now we are thinking about it again because of the free trade agreement and all the difficulties there. And I did a phone in about 6 weeks ago, and I said at the beginning, can we not rerun the referendum? Can we just all accept we have left, and it's the free trade agreement now, and just look to the future? I should have saved my breath. It was the most terrible hour of radio I've ever done, and I got really quite irritated towards the end of it, because people were just going back 4 years, and I just thought, oh my God, are we still here?
The answer is yes, of course, we will be, because I think so.
I did another one a couple of weeks ago, and it was actually much better, and people were much more constructive. And I do think that, I mean, let's assume, for argument's sake, that the free trade deal is done. I mean, I do think that will be a seminal moment in this. If it isn't done, this argument will go on for a very, very long time, and we see it today, where there's this worst case scenario document that Michael gave has been sent, 7,000 lorries queue and all the rest of it. People seem to ignore the fact that it's worst case scenario, but I mean, you have to plan for a worst case scenario, and that will reopen all the divisions if that sort of thing happens. But I mean, I am optimistic that there still will be a deal, and if there is, I think over time, in the short term, actually, that hopefully these divisions will be healed in well, as quickly as possible.
Ian, we must stop the conversation there. You've given us a helpful prediction there that there might be a trade deal. I'm not going to ask you whether you think there's going to be the result of the US election. Anyway, just to finish the event, I'd like to thank Ian for joining us today in this discussion of his book, which is available from, well, as it says here, it's out now. There's a link to purchase the book on the event listing and in the chat. Signed copies of the book are also available by his website. So I'd like to thank Ian, thank all of you for joining us today, and I hope to see you again at the LSE very soon. And goodbye.